How did you make your psycho roommates confess to being psycho? I came home to find an eviction notice on the door. It came after weeks of angry phone calls from our landlord, and I knew the only way out was to get a confession from my roommates. As soon as I saw it, I grabbed it and stormed into the living room, where all 6 of my roommates were watching Love Actually. Here's the deal. You're all subletting from Emmy illegally. If we get evicted, I lose my deposit, but you all get criminal records for illegal tenancy. Everyone went pale as I unplugged the TV cord. Confess in 5 minutes or I'm reporting all of you as trespassers to save myself. I set the timer on my phone and placed it on the coffee table. 5 minutes. Starting now. The timer showed 4 minutes 32 seconds when Riso suddenly cracked like an egg. I've been selling our groceries. The words exploded out of him. That's why food keeps disappearing. I photograph everything, buy the same items cheaper at Costco and pocket the difference. I made $400 last month. Deirdre's jaw dropped and her face went from shock to pure rage in about half a second. You're why my yogurt changes brands. I've been putting laxatives in my food to catch whoever was stealing it. Riso's face drained of all color and I swear he looked like he might pass out. No wonder my clients never come back, he whispered. Your clients? We all screamed in unison. Before anyone could process that bombshell, Miko shot up from the couch like someone had electrocuted him. Okay, fine. My girlfriend who's always visiting? She's been living here for 6 months. She showers at 3 a.m. That's what the noise complaints are about. She works from home when you're all out. Riso spun around so fast he almost fell over. I knew someone was using my desk setup. Miko wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. She pays me rent. $500 a month. I've been pocketing it. The timer showed 3:45 and suddenly everyone was confessing like we were at some twisted group therapy session. Ross, who usually barely spoke, blurted out, I've been telling girls on dating apps that I own this building. I bring them here for property tours. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what Aranasa said next. She stood up, took a deep breath and screamed, I've been living here with my mom. She's been in my room for 4 months. She sleeps under the bed when you're home. The room went dead silent. Then, I kid you not, we heard a muffled voice from Aranasa's room. Hello, everyone! Mom, get back under the bed! Aranasa shrieked. My brain was short-circuiting. Her mother had been living in our apartment for 4 months, under the bed, but the confessions just kept coming like some unstoppable avalanche of insanity. Deco was sweating bullets when he stood up. Since we're confessing, I'm not actually Deco Murphy. I've been using my cousin's SSN. The real Deco lives in Ireland. I blinked. You've been living here under a stolen identity? Not stolen. Borrowed. The timer showed 2 o'clock and I thought we were done. But then Sinan stood up. Quiet, sweet, never causes problems. Sinan cleared his throat and said, I'm not actually gay. Every girl in the room, including me, screamed, What? In perfect unison. I just said that to make you girls more comfortable when I applied for the room. Deirdre's face went through about 17 different emotions before landing on mortified. But we practiced making out together. You weren't even hard. Sinan shrugged. Well, you're not really my type. Aranasa looked like she wanted to commit murder. I changed in front of you. I'm really good at looking at my phone, Sinan said, like that made it better. The timer showed 0:45 and Ross completely lost it. Okay, the apartment next door that's been empty? I broke in and have been using it as my second apartment. I cut a hole through the wall in my closet. Aranasa screamed, There's a hole in our wall? I covered it with a poster. The timer went off with this horrible buzzing sound and suddenly everyone was yelling at once. Miko's girlfriend actually emerged from his room looking sheepish, and Iranasa's mom poked her head out asking if it was safe now. I felt like I was in some fever dream. Then came the knock on the door. My heart stopped. This was it. The landlord walked in holding a piece of paper and everyone went dead silent. So, about the lease violation, he said, and I swear you could hear everyone's hearts pounding. Someone put a plant on the fire escape. That's against fire code. He showed us a photo on his phone of a tiny, pathetic succulent sitting on the fire escape. Everyone slowly turned to look at me. That's my succulent, I whispered. I put it there yesterday for sun. Remove it by tomorrow. But the eviction notice, I stammered. Oh, the landlord laughed. That was just me being dramatic. I thought you'd know me by now, he said, and left. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Deirdre said in this deadly quiet voice, You made us confess to everything over a plant? Then we heard a muffled voice from inside the wall. Can someone let me out? I'm stuck in Ross's closet. Everyone screamed, Who is that? Ross rubbed his neck. Oh right, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. And before anyone could process that sentence, Ross was already running down the hallway toward his bedroom. The rest of us scrambled after him, tripping over each other and the furniture in our panic to see what fresh hell was waiting for us. Ross threw his bedroom door open so hard it banged against the wall and we all crowded in the doorway watching him yank open his closet. He grabbed the edges of a huge movie poster and ripped it down in one motion. Behind it was a hole in the wall. Not a small hole. A person-sized hole that someone had clearly cut through the drywall with actual tools. The muffled voice came again, louder now without the poster blocking it. The person sounded panicked and out of breath. Ross stuck his head through the hole and started pulling at something on the other side. His face had gone completely white, and he looked like he might actually throw up right there in his closet. I pushed my way to the front of the group and looked through the hole myself. In the darkness between the walls, I could make out an arm waving around frantically. The fingers were covered in white dust, and the person was clearly wedged in tight. Ross pulled his head back out and wiped sweat off his forehead, leaving a streak of drywall dust across his face. We all just stood there staring at him, waiting for an explanation that could possibly make sense of what we were seeing. Ross opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. The words came out in a rush as he explained that the person stuck was actually his friend from college, who he'd been letting crash in the empty apartment next door. He gestured wildly at the hole as he talked, like that somehow made it better. The friend's arm kept waving through the hole, and I watched his fingers flex and curl as he tried to find something to grab onto. Miko pushed past me to get a better look, took one glance at the arm sticking through the wall and just lost it. He started laughing so hard he had to sit down on Ross's bed, holding his stomach and gasping for air. The sound of his laughter mixed with the muffled yelling from inside the wall created this surreal soundtrack to the absolute madness unfolding in front of us. Aranasa smacked Miko on the shoulder and told him to shut up, but he couldn't stop. Every time he looked at the arm waving around, he'd start laughing harder. Ross ignored him and turned to Deco, asking for help in this desperate voice. Deco stepped forward and the two of them started examining the hole, trying to figure out how to make it bigger without bringing down the whole wall. They grabbed the edges of the drywall and started pulling, and chunks of white dust and plaster rained down onto Ross's carpet. The hole widened inch by inch as they worked, and more of the person inside became visible. I could see his shoulder now, then part of his chest, all covered in thick white dust. Ross and Deco kept pulling, and the person inside started pushing from his side. There was this horrible scraping sound as he squeezed through the opening, his shirt catching on the jagged edges of the broken drywall. More dust filled the air, making everyone cough and step back. With one final pull from Ross and Deco, the person tumbled through the hole and landed in a heap on the closet floor. He lay there for a second, coughing and spitting out drywall dust, before slowly pushing himself up to his knees. White dust covered every inch of him. His hair looked gray from it. His clothes were completely ruined. He stood up shakily and brushed at his shirt, but that just made more dust fly into the air. He looked around at all of us staring at him and gave this awkward little wave. Then he introduced himself and explained he'd been crashing in the apartment next door for about 3 weeks. His voice was hoarse from all the dust he'd inhaled. Before anyone could respond, before anyone could even begin to process what was happening, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, angry footsteps. The landlord Corey walked back into the apartment and headed straight for Ross's room, probably drawn by all the noise and commotion. He appeared in the doorway and stopped dead. His eyes went from the hole in the wall to Ross and Deco covered in dust, to the friend standing there looking like a ghost, and back to the hole. The color drained completely from his face. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. He just stood there staring at the destruction of his property, and I watched his hands start to shake. Corey's face went from white to red in about 3 seconds flat. He started demanding answers, his voice getting louder with each word. He wanted to know what happened to his wall, who made the hole, how long it had been there, and about 50 other questions all at once. Ross tried to stammer out an explanation about needing extra space and storage, but it sounded ridiculous even as he said it. The friend tried to casually brush more drywall dust off his clothes like that would somehow make the situation better. His hands left white streaks across his jeans and shirt. Corey pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of everything. The hole, the destroyed closet, the pile of drywall chunks on the floor, Ross and Deco covered in dust, the friend standing there looking guilty. He muttered under his breath about security deposits and repair costs, and how much this was going to cost to fix. He took at least 20 photos from different angles, and with each click of his phone camera, I felt my stomach drop lower. That's when it hit me. Everything I'd just done, all my threats about reporting everyone as trespassers, all my tough talk about criminal records and saving myself, it was completely meaningless now. I was the one on the lease. I was the one legally responsible for everything that happened in this apartment. Every single thing my roommates did, every hole they cut, every person they hid, every rule they broke, it all fell on me. Corey seemed to read my thoughts because he turned to me and started explaining exactly how much trouble I was in. He said anything my subletters did fell on me legally. Property damage, unauthorized occupants, lease violations, all of it. My name was on the paperwork. I was the one who'd be paying for the repairs. I was the one who could get sued. I felt my stomach drop to my feet and keep going, like it was falling through the floor into the apartment below. My hands started shaking and I had to lean against the doorframe to stay standing. All my roommates' secrets and schemes and lies, and somehow I was the one who ended up responsible for everything. While Corey kept ranting about the wall damage and taking more photos, I heard a door open behind us. Everyone turned to look. Aranas's bedroom door swung open slowly, and a woman stepped out into the hallway. She looked embarrassed and exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was maybe in her 50s, wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt. She walked toward us with her shoulders hunched like she wanted to disappear, but she kept coming anyway. When she reached the group crowded in Ross's doorway, she stopped and cleared her throat. This was Isabel, Aranas's mother, and she introduced herself to everyone in this quiet, tired voice. She apologized for the strange circumstances and explained that she'd lost her apartment about 4 months ago. She'd had nowhere else to go, and Aranasa had offered to let her stay temporarily. She didn't make excuses or try to justify hiding under the bed. She just stated the facts in this matter-of-fact way that somehow made it even sadder. She looked normal. That was the weird part. After everything we'd been through tonight, I half expected her to look wild or crazy, but she just looked like someone's tired mom who'd fallen on hard times. While everyone was still processing Isabel's appearance and Corey was still fuming about his wall, Deirdre suddenly grabbed Riso's arm. She asked if he was feeling okay, and her voice had gone sharp with concern. I looked over at Riso and realized his face had gone pale and sweaty. He was leaning against the wall like he needed it to hold him up. Riso admitted he'd been having stomach cramps all day, but he'd thought it was just stress from all the confessing. As soon as he said it, Deirdre's eyes went wide. Her face shifted from concern to pure horror as she made the connection. The room went quiet as we all realized what had happened at the same time. Riso had been eating Deirdre's laxative-laced food for who knows how long through his grocery reselling scheme. Every time he photographed her yogurt and bought the same brand cheaper at Costco, he must have been sampling it to make sure it tasted right. Or maybe he'd been eating her other food too, the stuff she'd been deliberately poisoning to catch the thief. Deirdre started panicking, asking Riso how much of her food he'd eaten, when he'd last eaten it, how bad the cramps were. Her words came out in a rush and she kept running her hands through her hair. Riso tried to answer, but another cramp hit him and he doubled over slightly, his hand pressed against his stomach. Miko stopped laughing and suggested we should probably take Riso to urgent care just to be safe. Everyone agreed immediately. Nobody wanted to deal with a medical emergency on top of everything else that had happened tonight. Maya stepped forward from where she'd been standing quietly near Miko's room. She offered to drive Riso to the clinic, explaining that she had a car she'd been secretly parking 2 blocks away for the past 6 months. Everyone turned to stare at her like she'd just materialized out of thin air. We'd all seen her emerge from Miko's room earlier, but it was like we'd forgotten she was real. She'd been this ghost in our apartment for so long that seeing her stand there making helpful suggestions felt wrong somehow. She shrugged and said she might as well be helpful now that everyone knew she existed anyway. Her voice was steady and calm, like driving people to urgent care was just a normal Tuesday night activity. Deirdre immediately said she'd go too, still looking panicked about how much laxative Riso might have consumed. The 3 of them headed for the door while the rest of us just stood there in Ross's destroyed bedroom. We listened to them leave, heard the apartment door close behind them, and then we were left in this awful, awkward silence. Corey was still there, still holding his phone, still documenting every inch of the wall damage. He moved around the room taking more photos, muttering to himself about contractors and repair estimates. The rest of us just stood there watching him, nobody knowing what to say or do. Ross's friend had finally stopped brushing dust off his clothes and was just standing there looking miserable. Isabel had retreated back toward Arenasa's room but hadn't gone inside, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to hide anymore. Corey finished taking his photos and turned to face all of us. He asked how long all these extra people had been living here. His voice was tired now instead of angry, like he'd used up all his rage on the wall situation. Nobody wanted to answer first. We all just stood there looking at each other, waiting for someone else to start explaining the impossible mess we'd created. I raised my hand like I was in the school or something, which felt stupid the second I did it, but everyone turned to look at me anyway. I told Corey it was all my fault, that I was the one who brought everyone in as subletters without his permission, that I knew it was against the lease, but I needed the money to cover rent. The words came out fast and jumbled, and I kept fidgeting with my phone that still had the timer app open on the screen. Corey just stood there listening, his arms crossed, his phone still in his hand with all those photos of the destroyed wall. I expected him to start yelling, to threaten eviction for real this time, to maybe even call the police or something. Instead, he just let out this long, tired sigh and rubbed his face with both hands. He said he figured something was up when the water bill tripled over the past few months, that he's not an idiot and he knew more people were living here than just me and my official roommates. My stomach dropped because I realized he'd known this whole time and just hadn't said anything. He looked around at everyone and said he didn't realize it was this extensive though, gesturing at Isabel and Ross's friend and the hole in the wall. His voice wasn't angry, just exhausted, like he'd aged about 10 years in the past hour. Then Corey started talking about insurance and everything got so much worse. He explained that because of the wall damage, he had to report it to his insurance company, which meant they'd send someone to inspect the apartment within the next few days. The second those words left his mouth, everyone started panicking. Miko's face went completely white and he grabbed the edge of Ross's desk to steady himself. Aranasa made this weird gasping sound and looked at her mom. Deco started breathing really fast and shallow. I felt like the floor was dropping out from under me because an official inspection meant they'd see everything. They'd see all the extra furniture crammed into rooms, all the personal belongings, probably even the modifications Ross made to his closet. There was no way to hide 7 people living in a space designed for maybe 4. Corey kept talking, explaining about contractors and estimates and documentation, but I could barely hear him over the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. Ross's friend, who'd been standing quietly in the corner trying to blend into the wall, started edging toward the door. He moved slowly, like maybe if he was careful enough nobody would notice him leaving. But Corey turned and told him to wait, that he needed his information for the incident report. The friend froze halfway to the door and his shoulders slumped. Corey pulled out his phone and opened some kind of notes app, asking for a name and contact information. The friend hesitated for a long moment, then admitted he'd actually been squatting in the empty apartment next door for the past 3 weeks. He said it so quietly we almost couldn't hear him, but the words landed like a bomb in the room. Corey's face did this thing where it went from tired to completely shocked to resigned all in about 5 seconds. He asked how the friend even got in there, and Ross's friend explained he found a way to jimmy the lock after Ross told him the place was empty. Corey looked like he'd aged another 10 years right there. He pressed his fingers against his temples and closed his eyes and just stood there not saying anything for what felt like forever. That's when Deco completely lost it. He started breathing really fast and heavy, like he couldn't get enough air and his hands were shaking. He kept saying he couldn't be here when the inspectors came, that they'd find out about his identity situation, that he'd get arrested or deported or both. His voice got higher and more panicked with each word. Sinan moved toward him and tried to put a hand on his shoulder, tried to tell him it would be okay, but Deco shoved him away hard enough that Sinan stumbled backward into Ross's bed. Deco ran out of the room and we heard him lock himself in the bathroom. The lock clicked really loud in the silence that followed. Sinan looked hurt and confused, standing there rubbing his shoulder where Deco had pushed him. Nobody knew what to do or say. We could hear Deco through the bathroom door, his breathing still fast and panicked, and it made everything feel even more real and scary. Isabel spoke up then, her voice soft and kind of defeated. She said maybe she should find somewhere else to stay before the inspection happened, that she didn't want to cause more problems for everyone. Arenasa's face crumpled immediately and she started crying, actually crying with tears running down her face. She grabbed her mom's arm and said she didn't want her to be homeless, that they'd figure something out together. It was the first time since this whole mess started that anyone showed real emotion, instead of just shock or panic or anger. Isabel pulled Arenasa into a hug and they just stood there holding each other while Arenasa cried into her mom's shoulder. The rest of us looked away, suddenly really interested in the floor or the walls or anything else. The moment felt too private, too real, and none of us knew how to handle actual feelings after all the confessions and chaos. The apartment door opened and we heard voices in the hallway. Maya and Deirdre came back with Riso between them, and he looked absolutely miserable. His face was pale and sweaty, his hair was messed up, and he was walking kind of hunched over like his stomach hurt. Maya was holding his arm on one side, and Deirdre had her hand on his back, both of them helping him walk. They got him to the couch in the living room, and he collapsed onto it with a groan. Deirdre explained that the doctor said he was really dehydrated, and his digestive system was irritated from all the laxatives, but there wasn't any permanent damage as long as he stayed hydrated and rested for the next few days. She had this plastic bag from the pharmacy with electrolyte drinks and some kind of medication. Riso just lay there on the couch looking like death, one arm draped over his eyes. Deirdre sat down on the floor next to the couch and started apologizing, the words tumbling out fast and desperate. She said she never meant to actually hurt anyone, that she just wanted to catch whoever was stealing her food, that she thought maybe they'd eat one yogurt and get sick once and learn their lesson. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, her hands twisting together in her lap. Riso moved his arm off his eyes and looked at her, and then he said he was sorry too. He said what he did was stealing no matter how he tried to justify it with his reselling business, that he had no right to take other people's food even if he was replacing it. His voice was weak and tired, but he sounded like he meant it. Deirdre started crying a little bit, and Riso reached down and squeezed her hand. It was weird seeing them be nice to each other after everything that happened. Miko got up and walked over to Maya, touching her elbow and nodding toward the corner of the living room. They moved away from everyone else and started talking quietly, but the apartment was small enough that we could kind of hear them anyway. Maya was telling him she was tired of hiding, tired of paying him rent to live like some kind of ghost in his room, tired of showering at 3 in the morning so nobody would know she existed. Her voice was steady but firm, not angry exactly, but definitely done with the whole situation. Miko looked down at his feet and his face was red with shame. He kept trying to explain or justify it, but Maya cut him off and said she deserved better than sneaking around in her own home. He nodded and apologized and said she was right. It was the first time I'd ever seen Miko look actually ashamed of himself instead of just caught. Corey interrupted everyone by clearing his throat really loud. He said he needed to go file all his reports about the wall damage and the unauthorized occupants and everything else that happened tonight. He'd come back tomorrow and we'd all sit down and figure out next steps together. Before he left, he looked directly at me and said this was the most complicated tenant situation he'd dealt with in 20 years of being a landlord. He didn't sound mad anymore, just tired and maybe a little bit impressed in a weird way. Then he walked out and closed the door behind him, and we all heard his footsteps going down the hallway, and then the building door opening and closing. The silence after he left was heavy and uncomfortable. We all just sat there in the destroyed living room. The TV was still unplugged from when I'd yanked the cord out at the start of this whole mess. My phone with the confession timer was still sitting on the coffee table, the screen dark now but somehow still feeling important. Nobody knew what to say or do. We'd gone from watching a movie to confessing everything to dealing with a medical emergency to facing eviction and inspections and legal problems. It was too much to process. Then Ross cleared his throat and asked if anyone wanted to order pizza. The question was so normal and mundane after everything that happened that it almost made me laugh. Everyone just stared at him for a second and then Miko said, "Yeah, pizza sounded good actually." Just like that, we were pulling out our phones to look at menus, arguing about toppings, trying to pretend everything was normal even though nothing would ever be normal again. Ross pulled out his phone and started scrolling through delivery apps while everyone else just sat there looking drained. Miko called out different pizza places and their delivery times, and we settled on the one that could get here in 20 minutes. Sinan stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly in the corner and cleared his throat in that way people do when they're about to say something they've been working up to. He looked at Deirdre and Aranasa and started to say something about being sorry for lying about the gay thing, but Deirdre held up her hand and cut him off before he could get 3 words out. She said she needed time before she could even look at him right now, and her voice was flat and tired but also really firm. Aranasa nodded hard and said the same thing, that she needed space to process everything. Sinan's face went red and he nodded and sat back down without arguing, which was probably the smartest thing he'd done all night. The silence after that was heavy and uncomfortable, and I realized we couldn't just sit here avoiding everything until the pizza showed up. I said we needed to figure out our plan before Corey came back tomorrow because he was going to expect answers, and we should at least try to get our stories straight. Everyone looked at me like they were waiting for me to tell them what to do, which was funny since an hour ago I was threatening to report them all. Ross said yeah, we should probably coordinate, and Miko agreed. Maya spoke up from where she was sitting next to Miko and said maybe honesty was actually working better than all our previous lies. The comment made everyone go quiet and look uncomfortable, but I could see people thinking about it. She had a point. All our schemes and secrets had created this whole mess, and the only reason we were even talking now was because everything got forced into the open. The bathroom door finally opened, and Deco came out looking a lot calmer than when he'd locked himself in there. His eyes were still red, but he wasn't breathing fast anymore. He sat down on the arm of the couch and said he was scared about getting deported or arrested for the identity fraud thing. His voice shook a little when he said it. Ross asked if the real Deco in Ireland even knew his identity was used, and Deco looked down at his hands and shook his head. He admitted his cousin had no idea, which made it even worse somehow. Isabel, who'd been sitting quietly near Arenasa's bedroom door, suddenly said she wanted to help clean up the wall damage since she felt bad about the whole situation. Ross looked surprised but said that would actually be helpful because he had no clue how to fix drywall. They both pulled out their phones and started Googling repair tutorials, sitting next to each other on the floor and scrolling through YouTube videos. It was weird watching Arenasa's mom and Ross huddled over a phone screen looking at home repair guides after everything that had just happened. The doorbell rang and everyone jumped. Miko went to get the pizza and came back with 3 large boxes that he put on the coffee table. We all grabbed slices and plates, but nobody really talked. The silence while we ate was somehow more awkward than all the screaming and confessing from earlier. Riso took 1 bite of his slice and then put it down, his face going pale. He said his stomach was still really messed up and he couldn't eat much. Deirdre looked at him and apologized again, and you could tell she felt terrible about the whole laxative thing, even though he'd been stealing her food. Riso said it was okay, but he definitely didn't look okay. Miko put down his pizza slice and said he wanted to officially tell everyone that Maya was his girlfriend, and she'd been living here because she couldn't afford her own place after losing her job. Maya added that she'd been applying for jobs every day and doing freelance work on the side, and she wasn't just some person taking advantage. She looked around at all of us like she was daring anyone to judge her, but nobody said anything mean. I swallowed my bite of pizza and said I was probably going to lose my security deposit over the wall damage, which was $1,500 I really needed back. The whole room went quiet because everyone knew I was the one legally responsible, even though Ross had caused the actual damage. It felt unfair, but that's how leases work when you're the one who signed. Ross looked up from his phone and said he'd pay for the wall repairs himself. I asked how he was going to afford that, and he admitted he'd been saving money by not paying rent on the apartment next door. Corey didn't know he'd been using it, and Ross had been treating it like his personal storage space and hangout room. The confession didn't even shock me anymore because at this point, nothing could. Aranasa turned to look at her mother and asked why she didn't just tell her she needed help finding a real place to stay, instead of hiding under the bed for 4 months. Isabel's eyes filled up with tears and she started crying, explaining she was too ashamed to admit she'd lost everything. She said she'd lost her apartment and her job and most of her friends, and she didn't want Aranasa to see her as a failure. Aranasa moved closer and hugged her mom, and they both cried for a minute while the rest of us pretended to focus on our pizza. We spent the next hour just talking about everyone's actual situations, instead of all the lies and schemes we'd been running. Deco explained how he'd been too scared to apply for a work visa properly because he thought his cousin's identity would get him in less trouble. Riso talked about how he'd started the grocery reselling thing because he needed money for his business, but then it got out of control. Maya described losing her job and feeling too embarrassed to ask for help, so when Miko offered to let her stay secretly, it seemed like the only option. Isabel kept apologizing to Aranasa for putting her in this position. Ross admitted he'd broken into the next apartment because he felt cramped and wanted more space but couldn't afford a bigger place. Sinan explained again about the gay lie and how he'd thought it would make everyone more comfortable, even though he understood now how messed up that was. It turned out most people had been hiding things because they were scared or ashamed, not because they were trying to hurt anyone. That didn't make it okay, but it made it make more sense somehow. Deirdre set down her pizza slice and stared at her hands for a long moment before she started talking about her last apartment situation. She explained how her previous roommate had stolen from her constantly, taken her clothes without asking, and even used her credit card to buy things online. She said she'd tried talking to that roommate multiple times, but nothing changed, and by the time she moved out, Deirdre had lost over $2,000 and most of her trust in people. She looked directly at Riso and admitted that when her food started disappearing here, something inside her just snapped, and she went straight to the laxative trap instead of having a conversation first. Riso nodded slowly and said he got it. He really did. But he also pointed out that there's a pretty big difference between protecting your stuff and actually poisoning someone. Deirdre's face crumpled and she started crying again, saying she knew that now and she felt terrible about what happened to him and his business. The room stayed quiet while she cried, and eventually Aranasa moved over to sit next to her and put an arm around her shoulders. Sinan cleared his throat and everyone turned to look at him, and he started explaining why he'd lied about being gay when he applied for the room. He talked about living in 2 different apartments where male roommates had made the women uncomfortable, following them around, making comments about their bodies, walking in on them changing. He said he'd watched female friends deal with creepy roommates who made their homes feel unsafe, and when he saw our apartment listing, he thought if he said he was gay, it would make everyone more comfortable having a male roommate. His voice got quieter as he explained that he genuinely thought he was doing something helpful, something that would make the women in the apartment feel safer around him. Deirdre wiped her eyes and said she appreciated that he was trying to protect people, but lying about something that basic was still really messed up. Aranasa added that consent isn't just about physical stuff, it's also about who you're comfortable being vulnerable around, and Sinan had taken away their ability to make informed choices about that. I spoke up and pointed out that we'd all changed in front of him, had personal conversations assuming he was someone he wasn't, and that felt like a violation even if he had good intentions. Sinan looked genuinely upset and said he understood that now and he was sorry, and he didn't know how to make it right. The clock on the wall showed it was almost midnight when Ross finally suggested we should probably make an actual plan for dealing with Corey and the inspection. Everyone shifted in their seats and the mood changed from emotional to practical in about 2 seconds. I said Ross and I would take responsibility for the wall damage since I was the leaseholder and he'd actually caused it. Ross nodded and pulled out his phone to start looking up repair costs, and his face went pale when he saw how much professional drywall work costs. Maya asked what everyone else should do, and I explained that we needed to figure out who was staying and who was finding new places before Corey came back. The silence that followed felt heavy, like everyone was doing mental math about their finances and options. Maya spoke first and said she wanted to get her own apartment now that everything was out in the open. Miko's head snapped toward her and he looked hurt, almost angry, and started to say something, but Maya cut him off. She explained that she didn't want him to be her landlord anymore. She wanted them to actually date like normal people instead of her hiding in his room and paying him rent. Miko's expression changed completely, and he said that actually made a lot of sense, and maybe they could look for places together, or at least in the same neighborhood. Maya smiled for the first time all night and said she'd like that, and they held hands across the couch cushions. Isabel stood up and announced she was going to stay with her sister upstate until she got back on her feet. Aranasa's whole body relaxed and she looked relieved even though her eyes were still worried. She got up and walked over to her mother and they hugged for what felt like 5 full minutes, neither of them saying anything. When they finally pulled apart, Isabel promised she would actually ask for help next time, instead of hiding under a bed for 4 months. Aranasa laughed through fresh tears and made her mom promise to call her every day and actually answer when Aranasa called back. Deco had been sitting quietly in the corner, but now he spoke up and said he needed to figure out his identity situation legally. His voice shook when he talked about being scared of deportation or arrest or never being able to get a real job. I offered to help him find resources for immigration lawyers, maybe even help pay for the initial consultation if he needed it. Deco looked at me like I'd just offered him $1 million and asked why I would help him after everything. I shrugged and pointed out that we were all kind of in this mess together now, and if we were going to fix things, we might as well actually help each other. The next few hours passed in a blur of cleaning and organizing and trying to make the apartment look less like a disaster zone. We threw away all the pizza boxes and empty bottles, vacuumed the living room, wiped down the kitchen, and tried to hide the worst of the damage. Ross called the building superintendent around 1 in the morning, and surprisingly the guy answered and agreed to come over to look at the wall. The superintendent arrived at 2 carrying a toolbox and looking annoyed but not surprised, like he'd seen this kind of thing before. He and Ross left for a 24-hour hardware store to get supplies for temporary repairs, and the rest of us kept cleaning. By 3 in the morning, the apartment looked better than it had in months, even with the obvious wall damage. Ross and the superintendent worked on covering the hole with a patch and some quick dry compound that wouldn't look perfect, but would at least make it less obvious. Everyone was exhausted, and we all crashed in our rooms for a few hours of sleep. The next morning felt surreal, like maybe the whole night had been some weird dream. Corey showed up at 9 with a woman he introduced as Penelope Slater, the building manager. They both looked serious and official, and my stomach dropped when I saw Penelope carrying a clipboard. We all gathered in the living room and sat down, and the silence felt different from the night before, more formal and scary. I took a deep breath and explained that we wanted to work with them to resolve everything properly, that we knew we'd messed up, but we were ready to fix it. Corey surprised me by saying he appreciated the honesty. He said most tenants would have tried to cover everything up or make excuses, but we'd at least been upfront once we got caught. He explained that he was willing to work out a solution if we were all committed to following proper procedures going forward. Penelope added that they'd rather keep reliable tenants who paid on time than deal with finding new ones and doing background checks and all the paperwork. She said the building had high turnover, and it was actually easier for them if people stayed. We spent the next hour negotiating the details, and I felt like I was in some kind of business meeting. The final arrangement was that I would keep the lease as the primary tenant, but Miko, Ross, and Deirdre would get added as official subletters with Corey's written approval. Everyone else needed to find new housing within 60 days, which felt fair even though it was stressful. Corey said he'd waive the usual subletter fees since we were being cooperative, and Penelope said they'd schedule the official inspection for next week to document everything properly. Ross pulled Corey aside the next morning and worked out the payment details while the rest of us cleaned up breakfast dishes. He agreed to pay $500 a month for 3 months to cover the wall repairs, and Corey said that seemed fair given the damage estimate from the contractor. I signed a form saying I'd give up my security deposit to cover anything beyond that, which hurt but felt necessary after everything that happened. Corey actually seemed relieved we were being so cooperative about fixing the mess instead of fighting him on it. Penelope called later that afternoon and said she'd contacted Carlos Reiner, the guy whose apartment Ross had been breaking into, and he wanted to come over and talk. We all felt sick about having to face him, but Penelope said he sounded pretty calm on the phone. Carlos showed up around 6 that evening carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes. He walked straight to Ross's closet, looked at the hole in the wall, and just shook his head slowly. Ross started apologizing before Carlos even said anything, talking really fast about how stupid it was and how he'd pay for everything. Carlos held up his hand to stop him and said he mostly just wanted his wall fixed properly, and his locks changed since Ross obviously had been getting in somehow. He wasn't even mad, just kind of tired and annoyed, which somehow made it worse. Penelope had brought a contractor friend who measured everything and said the repairs would take about a week once they got the materials. Carlos asked if we could wait until he moved some valuable stuff out of his apartment before they started the work, and we all agreed immediately. The next few days felt weird as everyone started making actual plans to leave or stay. Maya spent hours on her laptop looking at studio apartments she could afford on her freelance income. She found a place about 15 minutes away that was tiny, but had good light and fit her budget. Miko helped her fill out the application, and they stopped sneaking around, holding hands in the kitchen and being normal about their relationship. It was actually kind of sweet watching them be a regular couple after months of her hiding in his room. She got approved for the studio within 3 days and signed the lease that Friday. Isabel packed up her stuff from under Arenasa's bed, which was surreal to watch since we'd all gotten used to pretending she didn't exist. Arenasa drove her mom upstate that weekend to stay with her sister, and when she came back Sunday night, she looked lighter somehow. She said Isabel seemed happier with proper support around her, already talking about job applications and finding her own place eventually. Arenasa admitted she felt guilty, but also relieved to have some space and a normal living situation again. Deco finally stopped avoiding the identity problem and found an immigration lawyer through a referral from someone at his work. He met with her on Tuesday and came back looking less panicked than he had in weeks. The lawyer explained his options for coming clean about using his cousin's information and getting proper documentation. It was going to be complicated and expensive and take months to sort out, but having a professional helping him made it feel less impossible. He said the lawyer thought he had a decent chance of staying in the country legally if he handled everything correctly. Sanan found a roommate situation through a friend from his gym and moved out the following weekend. He came by on his last day to apologize one more time, standing in the hallway looking genuinely sorry. Deirdre told him she appreciated the apology, but needed more time before they could be friends again. Arenasa said the same thing, and Sanan nodded and said he understood completely. He left his new address in case anyone needed to reach him and carried his boxes down to the moving truck without much ceremony. Riso's stomach issues slowly got better over the next 2 weeks as the laxatives worked their way out of his system. He stopped looking green and started eating normal meals again. Weirdly enough, he took the whole grocery reselling disaster and turned it into something legitimate. He started advertising a bulk shopping service where he was completely upfront about buying stuff at Costco and charging a small fee for the convenience. 3 of our neighbors signed up within the first week because they liked the idea but didn't want to pay for their own Costco memberships. Deirdre stopped putting laxatives in her food once Riso confessed and apologized properly. Instead, she bought a label maker and started marking all her personal items in the fridge with her name and the date. Everyone agreed to respect the labels, and suddenly the food theft problem disappeared completely. It seemed so obvious in hindsight that we could have just communicated instead of creating elaborate revenge schemes. The contractors finished the wall repairs after about 10 days of work. They did such a good job that you really couldn't tell there had ever been a person-sized hole there, unless you knew exactly where to look. Ross actually took the poster that used to cover the hole and got it framed at a cheap frame shop. He hung it in the living room as a reminder of how ridiculous everything had gotten. We all laughed when we saw it, and even Corey cracked up when he stopped by to check on the repairs. The apartment felt different after that, like we'd all survived something together and come out the other side somehow changed. 2 months after the confession night, I looked around the living room and barely recognized the place. We were down to just 4 official roommates now, with proper paperwork and everything above board. Maya had moved into her studio and decorated it with plants. Isabel was settled upstate with a part-time job at a grocery store. Sanan was living across town with his new roommates. Deco was still with us but working with his lawyer on getting legal status. Ross, Miko, Deirdre, and I had the apartment to ourselves with our names properly on the subletting agreement. The weird part was that we actually talked about problems now instead of hiding things and creating schemes. When the toilet started leaking, we told Corey right away instead of trying to fix it ourselves. When someone's food went missing, we asked about it instead of assuming theft. It felt almost boring compared to the chaos we'd been living in, but boring was actually kind of nice. I texted Miko asking if he and Maya wanted to grab dinner sometime, and he responded within minutes, inviting all of us over to their new place that Friday. The apartment was small, but actually felt cozy instead of cramped, with plants on the windowsill and photos already hung on the walls. Maya answered the door wearing an apron covered in flour, and she looked genuinely happy instead of like someone sneaking around in the shadows. She'd gotten a job at a marketing firm and kept saying how grateful she was to have her own space where she could work without hiding. We ate pasta at her tiny table, and Miko kept reaching over to hold her hand, which was sweet but also kind of weird after months of pretending they barely knew each other. Ross asked if they ever missed the chaos of our apartment, and Maya laughed so hard she almost spit out her wine. The whole evening felt normal in a way that made me realize how abnormal everything had been before. The next morning, Arenasa's phone rang while we were making coffee, and she picked it up looking nervous. Her face completely changed when she heard her mom's voice, going from tense to relieved in seconds. Isabel had found a one-bedroom apartment near her sister's place and gotten a part-time job at a library. She kept thanking Arenasa for making her get proper help instead of enabling her to hide, and they made plans for Arenasa to visit in 2 weeks. After she hung up, Arenasa just stood there staring at her phone with tears running down her face, and I hugged her without saying anything, because sometimes that's all you can do. Deco came home from his lawyer meeting looking exhausted but less terrified than usual. The lawyer had explained the process for fixing his identity situation, which involved a lot of paperwork and fees and court dates, but at least there was an actual plan now. He'd been living in constant fear of getting caught for so long that having someone officially helping him felt huge. The lawyer said it would take months and cost a few $1,000s, but Deco could stay in the country while working through the process. He sat on the couch and just breathed for a while, and Ross patted his shoulder without making it weird. A few days later, someone knocked on our door around 3 in the afternoon, and I opened it to find Corey standing there holding a plate of cookies wrapped in plastic. He said he'd been thinking about confession night and wanted to check in on how we were all doing. We invited him in, and he ate cookies with us in the living room, laughing about how the whole story had become his favorite landlord tale. He'd apparently told everyone he knew about the succulent eviction notice and the wall hole and Arenasa's mom under the bed. Corey admitted he'd never had tenants confess to so many things at once, and he was genuinely impressed that we'd managed to sort everything out instead of just imploding completely. Ross ran into Carlos at the mailboxes one morning, and they ended up talking for 20 minutes about the wall situation. Carlos was surprisingly cool about the whole breaking and entering thing, and he even thought the secret passage was kind of funny now that it was fixed. They started getting coffee together on weekends, and Ross told me Carlos had the best stories about weird neighbors he'd dealt with over the years. One Saturday, I heard them both laughing in the hallway, and Carlos was joking that Ross should have just knocked on his door instead of cutting through the wall like some kind of cartoon character. Ross actually looked embarrassed, which was rare for him. 3 months passed, and Riso's grocery shopping service had turned into a real business. He'd made a website and everything, charging reasonable fees for buying stuff in bulk at Costco and delivering it to people's apartments. 5 neighbors were regular customers now, and he'd started paying back the people he'd overcharged during his reselling days. He kept a spreadsheet tracking every refund, and he said he actually slept better, knowing he was running everything honestly. The stomach issues from the laxatives were completely gone, and he'd gained back the weight he'd lost during those awful weeks. Deirdre started dating someone from her office, a guy named Joseph who worked in accounting. She brought him over for dinner one night, and he was nice but kind of boring, which seemed to be exactly what she needed after all the drama. She looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in months, actually smiling instead of constantly watching everyone suspiciously. Later, she told me the whole laxative situation had taught her that revenge tactics just create bigger problems, and she'd been working on trusting people more. She still labeled her food in the fridge, but now it felt more like organization than paranoia. My tax refund hit my bank account in early April, and I stared at the number for a solid minute before it sank in. I could actually replace the security deposit money I'd lost on the wall repairs. The $1,500 had been hanging over me for months, this constant weight of financial stress that made everything feel harder. I transferred the money to my savings account and felt something loosen in my chest, like I could finally breathe properly again. It was just money, but it represented not being completely broke and stressed all the time. 4 months after confession night, Ross suggested we have a dinner to mark the anniversary, which sounded ridiculous but somehow made perfect sense. We invited everyone who still lived in the building, and Maya came over from her place, and we ordered way too much Chinese food. We sat around the living room eating dumplings and laughing about how completely insane everything had been. Miko told the story about his girlfriend emerging from his room, and Deirdre acted out her horror at discovering the laxative situation, and Ross showed everyone a photo of the wall hole before it got fixed. It felt good to laugh about it instead of being angry or scared. Sanan texted me asking if we could all get coffee sometime, and I showed the message to Deirdre and Arenasa. They talked about it for a while before agreeing to meet him at a cafe downtown, somewhere public and neutral. The coffee meetup was awkward, with long pauses and careful word choices, but Sanan apologized again and seemed genuinely sorry about the lying. The women told him they appreciated that he was trying to make things right, even though they weren't ready to be friends again. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a start towards something less angry. Thanksgiving rolled around and Isabel showed up at our apartment carrying 2 pies and looking completely different from the woman who used to hide under Arenasa's bed. She'd gained some weight back. Her hair was cut and styled nicely, and she smiled easily instead of looking terrified someone would discover her. Arenasa hugged her at the door and later told me their relationship had gotten better than it had been in years, that therapy was helping Isabel work through the codependency stuff that made her feel like she had to hide instead of asking for help. Isabel spent the whole visit acting like a normal guest, sitting on the couch openly, chatting with everyone, telling stories about her new apartment and her job at a library. Nobody mentioned the bed or the 4 months of hiding, and it felt good to see Arenasa relaxed around her mother instead of stressed and guilty. A few weeks after Thanksgiving, Deco came home from meeting with his lawyer looking lighter somehow, like someone had lifted a weight off his shoulders. He gathered everyone in the living room and explained that his legal situation was mostly resolved, that he'd worked out a payment plan and gotten proper documentation to stay in the country while working through the process. The fear that used to make him jumpy and paranoid had faded, and he started sleeping better and joking around more. He even started video calling with his cousin in Ireland to apologize and work things out, which took guts considering how badly he'd messed up. Watching him become less stressed every day made me realize how much his constant anxiety had affected the whole apartment's mood. 6 months after confession night, I was doing dishes one evening and suddenly stopped with my hands in the soapy water, struck by how different everything felt. The eviction notice about my succulent had seemed like a disaster at the time, but it actually turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to us. We'd all been carrying these unsustainable secrets that were making us stressed and paranoid and unable to trust each other. Forcing everything into the open gave us a chance to build something real instead of a house of cards made of lies. Sure, we'd lost some roommates and I'd lost my security deposit and Riso had gotten sick and everyone had been mortified, but we were all better off now. The apartment felt calmer. People actually talked to each other about problems, and nobody was hiding mothers under beds or cutting holes in walls. Ross walked in the next day carrying a tiny succulent plant and holding it up like a trophy. He asked if anyone minded if he put it on the fire escape, and we all started cracking up because the joke was perfect. Corey happened to stop by right then to pick up rent checks, and when he saw the succulent and heard us laughing, he joined in and said he'd allow it just this once. We all stood there grinning at each other, and I looked around at the people who'd stayed and thought about how far we'd come from that night of forced confessions and screaming and discovering wall holes. The succulent sat on the coffee table between us, harmless and tiny, the thing that had accidentally saved us all.